through those are literally photographs off of my desk and just laid on the desk loose. But I picked them up and I said, well, they're kind of interesting. I'll show you, I think one over there is the guy cooking barbecue ribs, and on the back of it says $13 worth of ribs, and there's 13 racks of ribs on the stove or on the grill. And that's 100 yards from the front step of the City Hall at Cape Coral. And that's where that cabin was. It was 6 foot by 12 foot that you mentioned. And the 6 foot of it was made out of 2 garage doors from the Englehart Funeral Home. And the 12 foot were just leftover form boards and stuff that we used. Picture on the back of the boat there is the Moody's Alabel B, I think it was. Either that is the Markham. And that's Gerald Moody's boat,
Moody, yep.
Moody Road. Picture of me in my Bowles uniform from military school. There's miscellaneous Hugh Starnes, the judge, Bill Mosier that had the cigar factory, and myself.
Where's that?
And that 3 pictures here.
Is he the one who had the cigar factory in
Yeah.
Alhambra or where?
It was on Bremen Avenue.
Bremen.
And the cigar is still there, where they, his neighbor.
Well, they had another building that's a house now. But
Right.
complete place, and he only used Cuban tobacco. He had 6 of the 10 wealthiest men in the United States at the time were his customers that he sold cigars to. So I've still got some of the stuff. Dad took the press and everything down to the museum. So
Did
All right.
he use Cuban tobacco or Florida tobacco?
Cuban, and that's what put him out of business when he couldn't get Cuban tobacco anymore. He could have gotten it through Canada, and he said, "No, I'm not going to do that." But so that's when he retired.
1963.
Is that it?
Yeah, well, it's when.
He was quite an outdoorsman. He was a real interesting guy to hunt with. There's a picture there of Jim Roberts and Carl Roberts
You said this was in the cave.
in our little shed at Key Rye, right in front of the lady here. See that colored photo? Jim Roberts and Carl Roberts, y'all may know, and from the Methodist Church.
Jim Roberts was tax collector, wasn't he?
Jim was tax collector. He fussed at me for not voting for him, but that was 1940, the year I voted, so I was born. So.
Was he related to the Roberts Ranch in Collier County?
No relation. And they always talked about old Dias Roberts. Which Jim would talk about old Dias. And actually, Jim and Carl were not related either. But one time they finally met old Dias Roberts, found out he was the same age they were. So, picture of me standing by my dump truck at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
Wow.
So it was a big one.
Is that Cape Coral?
That's Hugh Starnes, the judge, Bill Mosier in the middle, and myself with a cowboy shirt.
It's in Cape Coral?
It was taken near the Roberts Ranch,
Oh,
which
okay.
was east of Immokalee. So, okay, what I'm going to talk about, I was going to try to ad lib, and I said, no, I better write it down. So I'm just going to kind of read it. So, and what I'm looking at is, everybody knows, or most of y'all know Barbara Mann, or knew Barbara Mann. So it's a little bit about her background and Dad's background. And of course, I got George Mann. I'm George Mann Jr. Of course, Dad was the only one that we called George in the family. Mm-hmm. I'm known as Pat because I was born on St. Patrick's Day. Ted is named Ted. He's also George, and the one on the right there is George. And Ted.
Georgia.
Yeah, and I'm Georgia.
I'll actually in this, you'll come up, I'll tell you where the names came from, but anyway. Well, I'll read that part, but anyway, Ted is named for our middle name, which is Theodore, and it's a nickname for Theodore. That's how he got that name. TJ is Ted Jr. So his name, neither one of their names mean anything, and neither does mine. Dad was the only George in the family. So.
Right.
All right, here we go.
I always heard that you were called Pat because that was your birthday.
Yep, St. Patrick's Day. Which was actually Palm Sunday at the time, I think, which was the latest. that Easter could be here or something like that. All right, this is about Frank and Pat and kind of where we came from. When I say I or my, I'm really meaning we or our, so I don't want to leave my brother out of it. So why was there a Barbara Mann? So we're going to go back a long ways. Not way, way back, but to start off with, in 1857, Fred Everett Brigham Smith was born in Britain, Connecticut. In 1859, an Irish immigrant named John Roach and his son formed a shipbuilding company on Hog Island in the Delaware River near Philadelphia. Today it's where the Philadelphia airport is. The company became the largest steel-hulled shipbuilding company in the world. They had the largest payroll of any company in the U.S. with the exception of the railroads, employing as many as 35,000 people. They prefab parts of a ship and they bring them in and then they're assembled. So they had people all over the country. So throughout the remote fabrication yard assembly operation. In 1880, they built a ship, the Columbia, which was the first ship with incandescent lights. John Roach bought Giuseppe Island, and he built a house. Friends talked him into building a hotel. His son, John Roach Jr., was friends with Walter Langford here in Fort Myers. They worked to have the Atlantic Coastline Railroad extended into Fort Myers. So now back to Fred Smith. Barbara Baltzman's mother's father. You got it? This is.
Say that one more
It gets a
time.
little deep. Yeah, it's her mother's father. Okay. Began work with the New Britain National Bank. In 1882, he became a clerk with the New York and the New England Railroad. In 1883, he married Helen McCoy, which was my grandmother, with my great-grandmother, and they moved to the Boston office of the Union Pacific Railroad. Their daughter Helen King was born in Akron, Ohio, where this one was born, and several more moved through different railroads. He was auditor of one, chief clerk of a couple, and then he ended up in 1899 to become the auditor of the Chicago Union Traction Railroad, or Traction Company. In 1907, it was organized as the Chicago Railway Company, which he became the comptroller. John Roach Jr. was the president. This was a street railroad. To us, we would call it, about trolley cars instead of, railroad, with thousands of miles of track throughout the Chicago area. Baron Collier advertised on the walls and the ceilings of the cars. Now you can start to see a little tie. That's what I'm trying to put together, All right. In 1909, Fred and Helen's daughter Helen, okay, my grandmother, married a Boston attorney, Franklin Balch. His ancestor, John, came to America in 1622 and built one of the earliest houses that are still here today in Beverly, Massachusetts. Franklin Balch's home was in the small village of Topsfield, having been built in 1750 by his ancestor, Benjamin. Their marriage lasted long enough for two daughters to be born in the old house. First Helen, number 3, and then Barbara. So Mom was the last one born in that house. In 1915, the marriage was over, and the mother and two daughters had moved to New York with her parents that had moved back from Chicago to New York now. 1911, John Roach Jr. and Baron Collier invited Fred to Fort Myers for the transfer of ownership of Giuseppe Island. Fred and Helen's first night in Fort Myers was in the Bradford Hotel. The view, a photograph in the museum, which is behind Genevieve, shows a poinciana tree between the hotel and the river. It was in full bloom, and Granzy, my great-grandmother Helen I, decided they should retire to Fort Myers. 1912, the Chicago Railway was bought by the city of Chicago, and Fred and Helen moved to New York City just north of Central Park. Fred had bought a houseboat and an orange grove in Twin Palms, which is across the street over here. And he and Helen, one, became snowbirds. In 1917, they were building a house on Coconut Drive, and this is made from, these pen and pencil set is made from the wood from that house.
Wow.
Yeah, go ahead. Lanny Moore owns a lumber company. He bought the house, so he had it remodeled. So he made some pins out of it. So anyway, let's see, in 1917 they were building a house on Coconut Drive. Helen number 2 loaded the 2 girls on a ship where they had to keep the blackout curtains closed at night because of the German U-boats, and moved to Fort Myers where they would live in the new house on Coconut Drive with Fred and Helen Smith. Fred and Helen number 1. Until 10 or 15 years later when they grew up and moved away. So that's where Mom grew up, was on Coconut Drive. In 1917, the government took over the Hog Island shipyard, remember, back to John Roach. And he recruited Fred out of retirement to become the comptroller. And that's not quite right. He was recruited by the John Roach that owned it. He lost it. The government took over, and the government recruited a grandfather or great-grandfather to come back up. So Fred grabbed several local businessmen, one of them was Harold Case's dad, and took them to Philadelphia. They built 122 ships by 1921. They had 50 shipways where the ships slide down, into the water and stuff. None of them were completed before the end of the First World War. However, about half of them were sunk by German U-boats in the Second World War. Fred was the closest to a father that Barbara had growing up, and I think a lot of her future success may have been learned from her grandfather. All right, now who was George Mann? So he gets left out a lot of times. So. A point of interest, George was born 4 miles from the shipyard where Barbara's grandfather became comptroller. George and his brother Weldon's dad, early in his career, was a motorman on a trolley and may well have operated around the shipyard. Their parents, James Greer Mann and Nellie Brooks, were Scots-Irish. George was named after his 2 grandfathers, George Brooks and Theodore Mann. Dad knew very little about his ancestry. He knew there was a cavalry captain that took his company to Harrisburg to protect the Union Railroad Center when Robert E. Lee was stopped at Gettysburg. They could hear the cannons as they approached, but by the time they got there, the battle was over. So, I may not have been here had he gotten there in time. My research found that the captain was in his late 40s, and he trained soldiers in Doylestown. He was a cavalry commander for the Union Army. The Union Army did not use much cavalry. He was also at the Battle of Antietam, but was probably used as a messenger. So we got pretty lucky there. James Mann, our grandfather, became an auditor for the Pennsylvania Railroad. His job was to pay mileage of all the Pennsylvania Railroad cars that traveled on other railroad tracks. So if a Pennsylvania Railroad car ran on the Atlantic coastline, then they had to pay them so much per mile, for their engine to pull it or whatever. After World War I, the swine and Spanish flu came to America and killed so many people they were hauling them out of Philadelphia by the wagon loads. The whole family had the flu. The doctor said the best protection from the flu was to get as far away from Philadelphia as possible and into a warm climate. Thomas Edison rented a private car from the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the railroad had to pay mileage to the Atlantic Coastline Railroad into Fort Myers. Our grandfather decided Fort Myers was about as far away and as warm as you could get. They loaded their 1917 Maxwell on a ship owned by the railroad and unloaded in Jacksonville, where the kids were running around barefoot in the snow on the docks. Now, I don't remember snow in Jacksonville, but it was then. The Dixie Highway to Punta Gorda was 10 feet wide and made out of brick. When you passed the car, you had to drop one side of your car off the road. This would kick up the edge bricks, and the next car would come along and cut their tire on the rolled up brick. Many tires later, they arrived in Punta Gorda. At 2 in the afternoon, people in a tourist court told my grandfather it was too late to drive to Fort Myers. Remember, there was no US 41. So they started out anyway. This was on a dirt road with burnt out bridges. Now, the cowboys used to burn the ground off to get the green grass to come back up for the cows. Well, they had little bridges every so often on a grade that the water could, standing water could get through. Well, they would burn the bridges up too, so you didn't have the bridge. So you had to get down off the road and go around the bridge and get back up on the grade. Well, it got late, and Dad and his brother would have to carry a Coleman lantern ahead of them. Remember, they left at 2 o'clock. They were carrying a Coleman lantern to see the best way to get around the bridge. And anyway, they started out. This was on a dirt road with burnt out bridges across drainage areas, and they finally ran out of gas in the dark. They saw a light through the woods and walked to a prison camp where they were able to get gas. They made it to somewhere along Luckett Road where they gave up and spent the night in and under the car. The remainder of that winter, the boys attended school, and James, my grandfather, worked for the South Fish Company. At 12 years old, they lived in the last house on 2nd Street, right where y'all are talking about. It's still there on the left side, just before you go around the corner on the seaboard. Okay.
Oh, wow.
They lived upstairs, and it belonged to Tommy Howard. He was 8 years old at the time. Dad was 12, and Tommy went on to be the president of the First Federal Savings Loan. I was on his board of directors for about 13 years. Put a couple daughters through college. So
Are we in 1917
anyway,
right now?
what's that?
1917 they arrived here?
In 19. It was 19
Oh,
that Dad
1919,
got here.
okay.
Yeah. So at 12 years old, Dad would drive the car from the last house on 2nd Street to the docks where he would pick up his dad. So you worry about being 16 years old or whatever. Anyway, they returned to Doylestown where Dad failed in a grade in school. Florida schools didn't count. Dad was extremely artistic and attended Drexel University, the institute back then, where he studied architectural design. He worked odd jobs as a carpenter and took night courses in art. He became the youngest law enforcement officer on the Pennsylvania Game Commission. The Depression got deep, and he became disenchanted with the Game Commission. He arrested a highway patrolman for shooting an illegal owl, and his superior did not want him to arrest the officer. And Dad said, if you do something illegal, it doesn't matter what your position is, you should be punished. So he went ahead and pressed the charges on the guy and came in and put his badge on the desk on him. And this is right in the middle of the Depression. The Depression got deep, and he became disenchanted with the commission, turned in his badge, packed up his Master 6 Buick Roadster, and headed to Fort Myers, where he knew he could live off the wildlife and not freeze to death. Somewhere around 1935, he took Mary Smith, later Mary Moody, to her uncle's orange grove where he was working. Just about dark, the car would not start, and they ended up walking back to Fort Myers. The only car that passed them was going south. And that was from Estero. And they walked all the way. I figured it probably took them about 5 hours. So anyway, that's the rough synopsis of where Frank and I came from. Brother Frank took the lead and became a showman, and I stood back and cheered. This is a little book that we just got last night. Frank gave it to us, but this is a whole nother story sometime. But